We've started an organization called the Ella Baker Organizing Fund, and it's a foundation to support organizing both intellectually and financially. We want to share a methodology of work. I like to call it technology of organizing, because we are at a period of history where the students, once again, black students, white students, all young people who are thinking and want to see justice are rising up. Everybody knows we need a united front to win. So we can't build a revolution or movement or make some massive change without figuring out how to go among the least of ours and bring them forward. And we believe that the milieu for that training is in black, brown, red, yellow communities of poor people. Now, who am I? I'm Curtis Muhammad, they call me. I've had many names. I was Curtis Hayes in history. I grew up in Mississippi. I was the child of families, communities who lived on plantations, who were left there since the Reconstruction era, after the Civil War. In the atmosphere these people had to maintain and nurture these communities was total independence. When Reconstruction ended in 1878, the black people who did not get off the plantation were actually living almost a slave-like life. And the people who did get off, they had to build those communities from the ground up. We cut trees and made lumber and built our homes. So people helped each other build. And we could take potatoes and peanuts and eggs and butter and milk and all kind of stuff to the marketplace and trade it for other items. So that's where I'm growing up. When I'm about 18, graduated from high school, I went to visit my father, who I had just found out he was my father. He had actually been in a situation with the Klan that tried to kill him, and he had defended himself and shot 7 of them, and he had to escape to Chicago, and he never came back. My family changed my name to make sure that white people wouldn't know I was his son when I grew up. But I discovered him after I finished high school. And he shared with me the stories of why he had left and why I didn't know who he was. And it is after this visit that I'm riding back to the South that Freedom Riders get on the bus I'm riding on and get beat up in Jackson, Mississippi. And I get to town and I go to Sunday school the next morning. And somebody started running toward me. Curtis, Martin Luther King brothers in town, talking about registering people to vote. And that was, I always refer to that moment when we got up the next morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, hitchhiked to town to meet Martin King's brother. It turns out it was SNCC, and they were starting their first project to organize in Mississippi. And I've been in that river ever since. That was 1961. But so this piece of work that this young people were doing in Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Arkansas, Georgia, North and South Carolina. That body of work were the most magnificent example of organizing I have witnessed in my life. And we did it with unity and support of the entire spectrum of the left movement. Now imagine what we were. We're in 1961, 62, 63, 64, 65, 66. And most of us have come from black college campuses that was built by the anti-slavery movement, by the Underground Railroad, by the descendants of the conductors and the people who had run away to Canada and educated themselves and kept their ideas alive. People who were experts at organization. In the 1960 census, we owned 30% of the houses we lived in, even in urban centers. In every city where we had 25,000 or more people, we had a hospital, a bank, insurance company, and businesses up in whole streets of businesses in these United States. Without the assistance of foundations, our government. It's important that we should remember that's the environment, that's the milieu in which the community invited us and held us and took care of us during this movement we call the Civil Rights Movement of the 60s. The men who had fought in World War II, they come home from the war, and they are given jobs in steel, postal service, auto, primarily up north. So there's a great migration of men leaving the plantations, going north to get these jobs. And they raise their families and create a new black middle class. And those families sent their children back to the schools they had been part of helping to construct in the South. Understand now, in this period, it was very hard for a black face to get in any school that was predominantly white, anywhere in the country. We built that stuff. All those universities, without the assistance of government. Now, they send their students back to those schools to go to school. But they live in Chicago, they live in Detroit, they live in New York, and they send their children south. And the children now want a hamburger at night. They want a milkshake. They get hungry, they study, and they realize that the local restaurants, which back then was basically lunch counters in drugstores and any other big business, and they discovered they couldn't eat hamburger at night or anytime. And they just got mad one day and wouldn't sit down, and got arrested, and they put it on the news. And my God, in 2 weeks, almost every campus throughout the South was doing the same thing. What Ms. Baker saw is an uprising of young people. She was already working with SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. She had already put that group together that Martin Luther King was now the head of. She sends us to elders. We get a few volunteers to go do this investigative work. And they would give us a list of towns and a car and a key and a tank of gas and send us from town to town and knock on doors for a whole week. And they went door to door. When they got to these elders told them, well, because our message was, we the students who've been demonstrating, we the students that've been sitting in, we the students that's been doing the freedom rides and all of that, and we want to know what we can do. What would you have us to do? And when we tallied that stuff, the people said, well, we proud of y'all. We so happy you're out here fighting for freedom, but we want the right to vote. Because you couldn't even register to vote if you were black, if you couldn't interpret a section of the Constitution. And over 65% of the people were totally illiterate. The plantations didn't educate people. In 1960, something like 1/5 of our people are still on plantations in the South. And that was a shocker to America when we revealed that kind of stuff. That people were still on these plantations, not being educated, suffering, just like slaves. So we moved to the plantations. We moved to the Delta of Mississippi. We moved our campaign. And now we go 3 years in this fight, offices being burned, people getting shot, and we sit down and folks say, you know, if we had white people on the ground with us, this would be a different day. And so we decided to recruit white people. And when we recruited the white people, we wanted to make sure that they had skills and that they had the ability and enough understanding to recognize that you had to follow the leadership of local people. You had to follow the leadership of the snake organizers, the dark-skinned folk, because they were closest to the problem. This discussion is about trying to find people who can be trained to enter communities under the leadership of dark-skinned folk, to learn how to solve some of these problems of unity between different groups, ethnic groups, particularly between folk of color and white people. And we have to say it like that. It's not to make white people feel bad. It's to make white people begin to talk about this issue. We can't behave like a slave master and expect to develop unity. We got to do the opposite of what that was. To go from that to a humility that allows you to listen to some beautician or some barbershop man or somebody in the community is a big change. And it's going to require some serious and severe self-training and self-development. Because even if you're black and you go to Harvard or Yale or Brandeis or even just a regular college and get a few degrees, we think we know it all. And we fail to hear, and we fail to recognize the genius of common people, poor people. The breakup, when we build unity, the thing that erodes unity most is the belief that those of us who have been to the master schools and to his universities and academies are better fit to solve problems of the poor and the oppressed than they are. We see Black Lives Matter in almost every major city in this country. It's a lot of little groups within the black community that is raising plenty hell. No matter what you hear in this discussion we have in here, we can't figure it out theoretically. And that's been one of the problems of our movement. We sit down and strategize and talk and read and have study groups and focus groups, and we think we got it. That ain't where you get it. We have to go in a particular laboratory, a particular milieu, in order to give the soil and the fertilizer and the irrigation for this thing. We have to create a culture for this thing. And that culture needs to happen in oppressed communities. We want 20 to 30 people to say, I am willing to embed myself in a poor, dark-skinned community. So the person would be trained and inserted into a community. This thing we're talking about has to begin with egalitarianism. It has to begin with everybody walking in the room feeling safe to give their best and to give their all. When we bring people to a meeting, we want them to be able to speak honestly and deeply about what they believe, what they hope for, what they want, what they're willing to lay their lives down for. You know, we want to hear people tell us these stories. And there's this vast amount of genius in the minds and the hearts of people who have struggled for freedom and struggled for livelihood, struggled for food, struggled for jobs, everything, all their existence, to wake up that genius and use it to build programs and forward motion. We recognize that there are many facets to this movement we're a part of. And we don't know all the names, but we know that there are people who are fighting for the environment. We're saying learn how to do that in a black, poor, dark-skinned, Latino, Native community, immigrant community. How would you talk about the environment in those communities? Would you be able to recognize garbage pickup as part of the environmental problem? Would you be able to recognize that in every city, the flood zones is where we live? The areas where the environment can attack first is where we live. Near the water, side of hills, in shacks that'll slide off at a moment's notice. Earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes. We are already poor people suffering from the effects of the environmental catastrophes. So how do you have that conversation at that level? It's who in those organizations are willing to learn how to talk about what they're talking about within that context of a poor, dark-skinned, non-white, non-intellectual, non-educated community. That Bernie Sanders campaign did galvanize a lot of those young people, because nobody figured out how to deal with black, brown, red, and yellow people. This is a problem. So when you say something about Wall Street, people think we're supposed to understand it. You say something about minimum wage, $15 an hour, we're supposed to understand that that's something for us. Well, we remember when we went to $7.25 and when we went to $5.15 and when we went to $4.65, the prices in the store went up a month later. So in our head, you got to stop the rise of the prices in addition to raising the funds. But what the hell does Wall Street have to do with black folks? We don't have no investments in Wall Street. We don't buy stocks. Well, Wall Street took your house. Maybe that would help. If you would show us that when you come and attack the thing that we invest our money in, which was real estate, because we thought it was real, we thought it was less gambling than Wall Street, and we bought houses and then Wall Street come took them. And then came back and took our tax money and bailed them out after they found out they had lied about the price of the shit they took from us. That's the way to talk about Wall Street. That's the language if you're going to be in a community of poor, dark-skinned people. We want to go to this conference and we want to take the people who respond to this discussion here to a very depressed community. And we want to sit with you for 4 to 6 hours. At the end of that meeting, we want people to be able to answer the question, are you willing to embed yourselves in a poor, dark communities? We want you to give a year to learn something different. What I visualize is a meeting every 2 weeks in 5 different communities with at least one organizer learning how to work with people of color. And in those meetings is where we would do our organizing. In those meetings is where we would teach the facilitation that allows everyone to have equal voice. In those meetings, we would feed people. We would do culture. We would do story circles. We'd create a loving environment. We'd create an environment that enhances and supports any ownership we want to give to this moment in history of youth rising up. That work around black people rising up against police brutality and mistreatment and injustice is a part of this energy base, and it is a very big part. I think all the movements are part of this moment. My business is to try to develop a united front to fight against oppression, because my people are at the bottom of this oppression, and we're dying like flies all over this planet. And I know while other people's oppression may not be as severe as ours, you're being oppressed by the same enemy that we're being oppressed by. And that we therefore need unity to fight a united and global enemy. And that's what we're talking about here, is creating a milieu so we can discover how we rise up together.